I have to say this is deeply disconcerting. I remember the days when there was 8 people turning up to these, so I'd planned accordingly. Right, well, Harlaxton Manor is, as we know, an American study abroad college, enabling students from the US to travel and study in the UK and in Europe, and in so doing, begin a journey to becoming more globally engaged, globally aware, global citizens, or as the current buzzword would have it, global citizens. It is now ranked as the #1 study abroad program in the United States, of which we're rather proud. Our students, however, are not the first global citizens to study at Harlaxton College. And great thanks to those who managed to get that photo to me with an hour to spare. If we were to go back a century to a different world, to a world then dominated by the British Empire, and to a world now at war, Britain having declared war on Germany in 1915, we'd be encountering not American students, but students from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and also the United States. Now, my research into their story began with the discovery of a photocopy of that picture about 2 years ago or so. And I was rather struck by it because everybody talks about the aerodrome in World War II. And I was looking at it and kind of discounted it and thought, oh, well, that's the aerodrome in World War II then. And then I suddenly realized that the plane coming in to land, and you can just see the shadow underneath it, is actually a biplane. Well, they didn't have them in World War II. So there's something rather odd going on here. And then I looked at the position of it and realized the World War II aerodrome was where that mirror is. So there's something very odd going on here. So with further research, I finally found this one in the Royal Air Force Museum showing the original photo with a nice fly coming down the screen. I mean, you couldn't script that. Well, he'll be joining us for the rest of our journey. Can you bloody believe it? Anyway, so here we have the original aerodrome plus fly from 1918. Now, it's here on this aerodrome, overlooking Harlaxton Manor, that these students began to train to be pilots, to be officers and to be gentlemen in the new Royal Flying Corps. The new aerodrome at Harlaxton was part of a massive expansion of the Royal Flying Corps' training infrastructure in England, which was needed to satisfy the Corps' insatiable need for more pilots to form more and more squadrons and to replace the pilots being killed or wounded or rotated through the training system and rested. As the Royal Flying Corps moved to a strategy of relentless attack, incessant attack, to establish aerial superiority and possibly aerial supremacy over the German air service. New aerodromes are built in Lincolnshire because of its open countryside and lack of industrial haze. And as you can see, it's a beautiful, clear sky if you're going to be practicing increasingly complex maneuvers. So this is ideal. And again, as you can see, that ridge is going to give you tremendous lift if you're flying basically a flying machine with a lawnmower engine in the front of it. You need the lift, particularly if you're inexperienced. And if you've been watching the buzzards work their way up and down that ridge line to Grantham and back again, you can understand the amount of lift that you're going to get. Work began on the aerodrome in October 1916, when workmen arrived from the Ministry of Munitions to clear away the hedges and the field boundaries and the trees and built new roads to allow for the delivery of all the prefabricated wooden huts and corrugated iron buildings that were to be assembled on site at the aerodrome. The aerodrome was also supplied with mains water and electricity, which ironically is something Harlaxton Manor didn't even get until the 1930s. The most spectacular of the aerodrome's buildings were, of course, the 6 huge hangars at the centrepiece of the aerodrome, with their distinctive bowstring roofs. These rose out of the arable fields requisitioned for the aerodrome following the last harvest in 1916, which is why you've got them coming out of the stubbles. There was always an inherent tension in the First World War between the need to produce food and to produce pilots, and aerodromes are eating up a tremendous amount of arable land, but they're having to find that balance. But the aerodrome planners can use a compulsory purchase order to get hold of that land. These hangars housed the all-important aeroplanes used to train fledgling pilots. Aeroplanes were the new wonders of the day, machines literally at the cutting edge of technology and modernity. But these are also still the pioneering days of flight, with flyers before the war earning their living racing these new flying machines and testing the limits of their aerobatic possibilities. And for those of you of my vintage, as opposed to any of the students, we all grew up with those magnificent men in their flying machines, which is a fantastic movie, and anybody under 25, go watch it, it's a great movie. But that's essentially what they're doing. The military possibilities of these new flying machines were also quickly recognised by all the great powers, which is why in 1912 Britain formed the Royal Flying Corps. The aeroplane offered unparalleled possibilities for reconnaissance, a role traditionally undertaken by the elite cavalry regiments. Indeed, throughout the war, the association of flying an aeroplane with riding a horse was made consistently, the assumption being that the good hands and the good seat required to be a good horseman readily transferred to being a good pilot. That wasn't necessarily the case, but that was the assumption. This accounts for the high percentage of officers from the socially exclusive cavalry regiments joining the Edwardian Flying Corps. In France in 1915, a Canadian pilot, on joining his Royal Flying Corps squadron, found his fellow officers were immaculately dressed ex-cavalry officers with well-trained servants to ensure they remained polished. Nearly all of them bore a proud family association with the British cavalry, and they had put away their regimental saddles and spurs reluctantly. Generations of tradition had been set aside as obsolete. One vestige of the old ways remained, however, as in most operational Royal Flying Corps squadrons, several horses were kept for the recreational use of officers, thundering around the fields of France on horseback. Similarly, in the Bayeux Amateur sector in France, a most distinguished field, beautifully mounted on their first charges, hunted hares with hands up and down the gun lines, shelling the Germans. These were officers who, as was the custom at the time, had paid for their own flying lessons and obtained a Royal Aero Club certificate certifying they were a qualified pilot, before then transferring to the Royal Flying Corps for their service training. As a result of this cavalry heritage, neither the R.F.C, which I'll start using instead of Royal Flying Corps, neither the R.F.C or its successor, the Royal Air Force, which was formed in 1918, became what I've termed, it's a clunky word, but I quite like it, became a new technocracy. Or as David Edgerton states, a corps of flying civilian or military engineers. This was because, as he also states, it represented the bringing together of technology with the aristocratic martial spirit, and the association of piloting with horsemanship was an obvious manifestation of this combination. The irony of that is that the often quite literally breakneck flying of the pre-war pioneers, the stunt or the show flying, the aerobatic flying that amazed the crowds gathered to watch the air shows and the air races of those pre-war days, was not being taught to service pilots during their initial training in England. Pilots were being trained to perform a reconnaissance role, not a combat role. And if the Royal Flying Corps was not going to perform a combat role, as it was envisaged at the time, it was not necessary to train pilots to dodge, jink, zoom, or loop like civilian stunt flyers. Pilot service training was thus, in many respects, an extension of the flying lessons needed to get their Royal Aero Club ticket. However, the Germans were, unsurprisingly, unwilling to let the British fly freely over their trenches and see what they were up to. Pilots on active service in France were very soon learning how to dodge and jink to effectively avoid being shot down by anti-aircraft guns, because the Germans suddenly realised they could point their guns upwards and shoot at the planes. Or by the new flying machines being developed by the Germans, fitted with machine guns that could actually fire through the propeller with an interrupter gear. So effectively you've created a flying machine gun that can be pointed and aimed at the opposition. The problem was that the BE-2, the Royal Flying Corps' reconnaissance workhorse in the first half of the war, the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2, was slower and less manoeuvrable than these German fighters because it wasn't designed as a combat aeroplane. It was designed for reconnaissance. It was designed to flow stable and level patterns, not to jink about the air. In response, the Royal Flying Corps had to develop its own fighting machines to go on offensive or fighting patrols to then protect the reconnaissance machines, to fulfill the primary role of the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War. But this also meant developing and refining the new tactics of air-to-air combat, of dogfighting, of flying in formation, or flying with a wingman on your wing. And all of this was having to be learned by service pilots in France because the training system in England, mass-producing pilots able to take off, turn around and land, was now seriously lagging behind the operational reality of the air war in France. As a result, according to Arthur Gould Lee, most pilots average 15 to 20 hours flying when they arrive in France, with maybe 10 to 12 hours solo. This was early 1917. 5 on the type they're expected to fight on. With that amount of piloting, they can't even fly, let alone fight. But despite a life expectancy which in times of high attrition could be measured in days, they did fight to protect the vital work of the reconnaissance machines. This was a side of the air war in which the crews of the reconnaissance machines, the pilots and the observers, were also now developing the art of aerial photography and ground-to-air coordination or cooperation. With the army, by acting as rangefinders for the artillery that was now targeting the German strongpoints and the German artillery. Once the war solidified, it's going to become an artillery war. You can't do reconnaissance across trench lines. Only the aeroplanes can get up high enough to target the artillery, which you're going to need to punch through a trench line. And that is why we also have this remarkable photograph from Harlaxton Park for 1917. It shows a complete set of trench lines, 2 opposing trench lines, a German trench line and a British trench line. It's even got the shell holes marked out on it. So you've got basically a recreation of the Western Front in France being photographed or photographed by a pilot observer at about 10,000 feet or so, learning those skills of aerial photography. Again, technologically, the Corps was at the cutting edge of modern technology. It was also then possible, by setting off smoke bombs, to practice signalling the position of a shell burst, like you would do in France, from an aeroplane using Morse code, with the transmitter being in the aeroplane and the receiver being on the ground, to practice how you would transfer that information so that the gunners can progressively improve their aim and their targeting to facilitate the artillery war. Aircrews undertaking this advanced reconnaissance training were also using the Royal Flying Corps' latest reconnaissance machine, which replaced the BE-2, the RE-8, and here's a modern recreation of them flying over the English Channel, which had a machine gun that could fire forward through the propellers for the pilot, and a machine gun with a wing mounting for the observer sat at the back. They could then defend one another. Another slight drawback of the BE-2 was that the pilot sat behind the observer, which meant if he had a machine gun, he'd shoot the wings off, which was a slight tactical flaw. So that's it's a controversial aircraft, but you got a better chance in it than a BE-2. However, in France, the reconnaissance machines would hopefully not have to fight independently. Hopefully, they would be operating behind a screen of offensive patrols by the Royal Flying Corps' new dedicated fighter squadrons that began to appear in 1916. In 1916, the Corps also recognised that with the appearance of these faster, heavier, more powerful machines, this would only exacerbate the issue of pilot inexperience among those pilots arriving in France, especially given the way they would have to throw these machines about in the sky, given the appearance of these new German Albatros fighters at the end of 1916, which was a formidable fighter through the second half of the First World War. In 1916, therefore, a new training curriculum had to be devised and began to be introduced. Before graduating, a flying officer was now, if I can get it, a flying officer was now required to before graduating as a flying officer and putting on their coveted wings, pupils were now required to climb to 6,000 feet, switch off their engines and glide down, landing within a circular mark about 50 yards in diameter, which we can see here at Harlaxton. So the idea is you glide down and pop it in there. Pupils also needed to successfully complete a 60-mile cross-country flight flying solo, during which they had to land at 2 other aerodromes. Given the mechanical unreliability of these early machines, this could result in having to make a forced landing in a field. As Stanley Rutledge, a Canadian training at Harlaxton, explains, "I had my first forced landing on Friday morning, which really means landing without aid of an engine. The majority of these landings, need I say, turn out badly. Sometimes the machine is broken, and sometimes the pilot is battered. Luckily, I drew up 10 feet from a hedge and didn't do any damage." By contrast, Leslie McNabb, a New Zealander training at Harlaxton, was gliding down when he saw a hedge dead straight in front of me. On with the engine, and I hop it like a steeplechaser, keeping her nose in the air to make a pancake landing. Praise be, I'm on an even keel, and quickly scramble from the wreckage, fumbling for a cigarette to soothe me. Eric Furlough, another trainee pilot in Harlaxton, so they're dropping like flies all around the countryside, had his engine stall as he tried to clear a hedge when flying out of a field. And I fell in a heap on the other side, having wrapped the wings right down the machine. And I remember finishing upside down with the wings all around me, and looking through, I could see petrol dropping on the hot engine. And I thought, the sooner I get out of this, the better. Classic understatement. So I fought my way out, tearing whatever I could, and climbed out. And that was the end of that. Accidents were almost a daily occurrence at the aerodrome and in the surrounding countryside. Yeah, I love from the way the guys actually penciled this into his photo album, DH6 making an attempt for the hangar, and missing rather badly. Accidents were a daily occurrence at the aerodrome and in the surrounding countryside. On average, in training in England in World War I, pilots were wrecking 2 machines and destroying 6 undercarriages, on average. So multiply that up by 200 or so pilot officers, you get to see they're going through quite a lot of planes. However, more importantly, alongside what was still advanced reconnaissance training, trick flying was at last encouraged, but the key word there is encouraged, not required. The revolution in pilot training, which Harlaxton is part of and goes through that process, the revolution in pilot training occurred in mid to late 1917, when the Royal Flying Corps formally adopted the training model developed by Robert Smith Barry. It was his belief that pilot training needed to replicate actual combat as closely as possible, practicing advanced maneuvers in training in England rather than having to pick them up as you went along in the field in France. Which is how pilots are trained today. The Smith-Barry model, as Sir Hugh Trenchard, the commanding officer of the Royal Flying Corps, described it, Barry's the man who taught the world to fly. And that's precisely how we're trained today. Now, this is a blatant appeal to the American audience, and I do apologize to my British colleagues, but one has to do these things. The Americans have home field advantage on us in this occasion. If you watch Top Gun, and you watch those US Navy pilots, they are effectively training according to the Smith-Barry model developed in 1917. Replicate combat training as closely as you possibly can. And that's what pilots at Harlaxton began in late 1917. And this is Second Lieutenant William Dale from Saskatchewan in Canada, who's in his BE-2 about to go on his first ever solo flight. Pilot training in 1917, as opposed to what had been gone through previously, now consisted of 2 stages. There would be elementary training and higher training. In the former, pilots learned to take off, turn around and land and obtain their Royal Aero Club ticket or certificate. In machines that in 1914 had been state-of-the-art weapons of war, but now, given the speed with which the war was developing, something like a Morris Farnham Shorthorn, which was state-of-the-art in 1914, is essentially obsolescent and reserved for flight training and hitting hedges and flipping over. Sitting in a machine with an instructor in elementary training was not without incident. For example, Eric Furlong was turning the aeroplane when his instructor wrenched the controls out of my hand and threw it into a bank. "This is what I want, do it like this." We got to the next corner and he wrenched it out of my hands again and showed me how to go round. And on the last corner, he didn't give it back to me. And I just sat there and watched. And we were gliding in, and we went straight in, slap into the ground, wallop, and smashed the machines to smithers. And he said, "What the hell did you do that for?" And I said, "Well, I didn't touch it." And he said, "Well, neither did I." He thought I'd got it, and I hadn't. That was my first exciting landing in a Morris Farnham Longhorn. However, once a pupil obtained his ticket, he could progress to his higher training in more powerful machines, beginning with the BE-2, which was now an ideal trainer and relegated from the front line, and then progressing to more powerful service machines like an RE-8 or these DH-4s in the hangar at Harlaxton, which was effectively a light bomber in service situations. And using these much more powerful machines that could be thrown about the sky, which you couldn't really do with a Morris Farnham or a BE-2 for that, you can now take these and start chucking them about the sky in much more aerobatic flying. A sensation described by Rutledge in October 1917 when flying a DH-4. "I do not know any sensation to equal that of stunting. Suppose one goes up for a loop. The nose of the aeroplane is thrust down until a speed of 100 miles is registered. Then one pulls back the joystick and the plane begins to climb. Applying pressure gradually, one points the nose heavenwards, and the plane stalls and flops over. It is when one is upside down at the height of the loop that one gets a sinking feeling, like unto nothing I know, and one wonders if the thing will go over or stay upside down forever. But the spin is the greatest of the spectacular stunts. One comes hurtling down, inside out and outside in, as it were. The uninitiated would swear that the aeroplane was out of control and falling to earth. But generally, all comes right. But alongside learning to fly aerobatically, pilots also needed to learn how to fly in formation. In France, the object of a patrol was to fly into enemy airspace to find and engage the enemy in this relentless offensive to establish air superiority. So the British are deliberately fighting inside German airspace. But this meant flying in formation to avoid yourself. So they're looking to try to surprise German formations, but to avoid themselves getting surprised because they're in German airspace, you have to fly in formation. The basis of formation flying was mutually supporting pairs, with a lead aeroplane and this new feature called a wingman, who is designed to sit on your wing and basically watch your back. This was practiced in England with mutually supporting pairs. And then in France, the formation could be expanded into a battle formation of 3 machines, 4 machines, or 6 machines. But learning how to keep station, learning how to sit on another pilot's wing, is where the analogy between flying and horse riding breaks down. Because if that occurs in cloud flying, it was very easy for a pilot to become completely disorientated and lose his position in the clouds. Indeed, one of the very worst accidents at Harlaxton occurred in May 1918, when an RE-8 being flown by 2nd Lieutenant Meyer Levine, aged 18, of number 53 Squadron, and an RE-8 flown by Lieutenant Arthur Thorne, aged 23, and 2nd Lieutenant Howard Watson, aged 18, practicing this flying in mutually supporting pairs, keeping in station. The wings touched, they collided, and all 3 were killed. Pupils were, however, now being given effectively double the amount of time in the air, including 5 hours in a machine they were going to fly in France, to familiarise themselves with its handling qualities. 2nd Lieutenant T.H. Hampshire, training with 54 Training Squadron at Harlaxton in 1917, states, "I shall always remember Harlaxton, as it was there I completed my 5 precious hours on the little Bristol Scout prior to being posted overseas." However, there was one more step before a pilot finally went overseas, namely a short course in dogfighting in a so-called finishing school. One of these finishing schools was at nearby Spitalgate Aerodrome. As Rutledge explains, "Well, this has been quite a week. I have been on what is termed a fighting course. The purpose of such instruction is to prepare pilots for the conditions which have to be met when overseas," which is the revolution compared to where we were in 1914. A pilot's efficiency must necessarily depend on his ability to maneuver his aeroplane in such a way as to ward off the opposing plane and place his opponent in a hazardous position. Thus, he must know how to stunt fly. If one flies straight, like they were being trained for in 1914-15, a Hun can simply sit on his tail, as the expression goes, and pump lead into one's machine. But supposing the pilot has mastered his plane, then his opponent is thwarted. That is what our program consisted of. We stunt. One goes aloft and throws the machine about, careless of equilibrium, negligent of the laws of gravity. Thus does man and aeroplane become one. So the fighter pilots who left Harlaxton in late 1917, as opposed to those who left in early 1917, as late as that, the pilots who left Harlaxton in late 1917 and 1918 had therefore undergone a training program that had been revolutionized and had given them a far greater level of technical proficiency and confidence in the air. However, some of the most talented graduates were being kept back to work as instructors because there's this perennial shortage of pilots to fulfill all the functions necessary. So if you've got a talented pilot, you'll hold him back once he's graduated and put him into a training instructor role. And this included Stanley Rutledge, who wrote home, "I have, strange to say, been referred to as quite daring and overly confident. But that does not seem to me to be a true statement of the case. I've looped and spun the DH4, not an unusual feat, but one the ordinary chap does not do for some time. But by nature, I am not of an adventurous disposition, and yet there is that within me which makes me want to be reasonably proficient. I always calculate and think over the business in hand. I may take chances, but I'm always looking ahead. And in little emergencies, it is possible for my mind to work well. Rather egotistical, this, I know." And tragically, less than a week after writing that letter, his plane crashed and he was killed when coming into a land. But, as his friend from their days together in the infantry explained, because this is the great irony of it, he survives the Somme and gets killed in a field in Lincolnshire. But as his friend from their days together in the 28th Canadian Infantry explained, "This was an accident liable to happen to any of us." And this kind of matter-of-fact response was necessary given the scale of the losses being experienced in training. There's the great line with regard to the First World War of no empty tables in the frontline squadrons. There would never be an empty seat at a table at a breakfast table in a frontline squadron. Maintaining that continuity, you don't dwell on the loss, you move forward. Well, they're getting the same experience in England, because one of the most sobering facts of the air war in World War I is that of the over 14,000 pilots killed in the Great War, approximately 8,000 died in England, or nearly over half died in training. At Harlaxton, the list extends to over 30 fatalities, which averages out at just over one fatality a month during the period it operated as a training aerodrome. As Leslie McNabb noted in his diary in August 1918, 2 are killed here on RE8s in the last fortnight. It comes so unexpectedly. A short time before, in the mess at lunch, laughing and talking, and a few minutes after lunch, snuffed out like a candle. The 2 pilots in question were most likely Flight Cadet Harold Buckley of 53 Squadron, who was killed flying in an RE8 in July, and Second Lieutenant Arthur Cross, aged 23, who was with 20 Squadron and was killed whilst flying again in an RE8 in July. But, regardless of these losses, there was an almost continuous supply of recruits and volunteers eager to get into the air, such as these flight cadets at Harlaxton in 1918, with their distinctive white flashes in their caps. When they graduated, they received their wings and their commissions as second lieutenants. Previously, in 1917, pupils received their commissions before starting their training, their advanced training. But like these cadets, they could only wear the distinctive Sam Browne belt. For those of you who are not familiar, it's that belt, the Sam Browne belt, to complete their cavalry-inspired uniform on graduating as a flying officer. So only when you become a flying officer can you put that belt on, which is why you've got this mix of some officers with a Sam Browne and some officers not with a Sam Browne. Some have graduated, some haven't graduated. The original highly polished officers of the Royal Flying Corps had been aristocratic ex-cavalrymen in the main, who already had a commission when they transferred into the Corps. Subsequently, as the Corps expanded and losses increased in 1914 and 1915 and into 1916, The Royal Flying Corps looked to the public schools for its pilot officers. As the official war historian of the Royal Air Force, the fabulously named Sir Walter Raleigh, observed, "They were a body of youth fitted by temperament for the work of the air, and educated as if by design to take the risks with a light heart." The iconic public school boy flying officer, educated in a gentlemanly tradition, was thus equipped with enough stiff upper lip to pull through. As a result, according to Ian Mackesy, the Royal Flying Corps was firmly public school, and its squadrons, at least initially, were elite establishments in which working class applicants tended to find scant welcome. Ironically, it was the working class flight mechanics who kept the aeroplanes in the air who probably had the best and most intense grasp of this new technology and its possibilities. Although by 1918, it was American mechanics, such as the 50th Aero Squadron raised in Texas, who were keeping the training squadrons in England in the air. This was because, with the British forming more and more operational squadrons in France, the majority of British mechanics had to be sent to France. To fill the gap in Britain in the training squadrons, Britain turned to the US. And so US mechanics now got their training in England alongside British mechanical instructors, which is why you have the officers here, the mechanics here, and the mechanics here, and these lads there are in the American uniform of the American Air Corps. And you've got those classic American stripes where you have that row at the top and the row at the bottom, as opposed to the English ones, which is a nice straightforward V. As the war progressed, and the mechanics would train up in the UK, and then they would join up with the American pilots who were being trained in the US, in Canada, and France to then form the operational squadrons in France. As the war progressed, however, and the need for ever more pilots was always pressing, the social exclusivity of the Corps had to be tempered by the necessity of finding individuals with the right temperament and the nerve to be a flyer. As the Lancet, a medical journal in the UK, as the Lancet commented, "Flying is not now confined to the public schoolboy or the cavalry officer or the athlete. We take many of our pilots at present from the lower middle classes and the artisan classes, i.e. mechanics." As Patrick Bishop states, the Air Force was to act as a machine of social transformation, elevating likely young men from the lower classes and making them officers. Young men such as William Leedham, a flight mechanic third class who is selected for flight training and arrived at Harlaxton to become Second Lieutenant William Leedham in 1918. So these guys can become those guys. Not really possible in 1914, but is certainly possible in 1917, 1918. As the director of Air Organisation, Sir Sefton Branca, pointed out, giving a commission to a pilot raised his social status and brought him into the officers' mess, with the result that his morale was higher. Of course, this was only a temporary wartime commission, so these individuals were technically only temporarily officers and were therefore, like the temporary officers in the infantry, only temporary gentlemen. To be an officer was to be a gentleman, albeit temporarily. The question then becomes, were these airmen refashioning themselves into something new, a new model of the officer and the gentleman? When George Jones, an Australian mechanic at Harlaxton in 1917, and a future Australian Air Marshal and Knight, decided to become a pilot, he realised his training also included learning to live like a gentleman. Now, the highly polished aristocratic cavalrymen originals were becoming a minority, were becoming a memory, but they remained a hugely influential memory and role model for these new officers who were selected for the Corps because of their technical proficiency and temperament. Indeed, is it purely coincidental that flying officers who were now selected meritocratically, who then exhibited the same reckless daring as the aristocratic ex-cavalrymen and fox-hunting originals, trained at aerodromes that were built amidst the great estates that produced their predecessors? At the heart of these great estates were some of the great stately homes of rural England: Belvoir Castle, Harlaxton Manor, Denton Manor, and you can replicate this pattern again and again and again. Pilots were therefore flying over the chimney pots of the social elite of Britain and the Empire. But pilots weren't just flying over the rooftops. Pilots were being invited into these houses and into the socially exclusive world of the landed aristocracy and gentry. At Harlaxton Aerodrome, for example, pilots were invited to go shooting, which may not seem such a remarkable thing. However, shooting was a sport preserved for the exclusive enjoyment of the social elite. Thomas Pearson Gregory, the squire of Harlaxton Manor, was a nationally recognised expert on the rearing of pheasants and partridges, although in wartime shooting was limited to clay pigeons. However, the fact remains, pilots were being invited into these shooting parties. Pilots were being invited to go fox hunting. Leslie McNabb attended the local meet of the beaver hunt. All is bustle and activity in the bright frosty morning, with all the yapping of the hounds and the stamping of the horses. This was followed by the hunt ball, with many of the local gentry, some still in their little red coats. And Captain Cross, a Canadian full of ribbons and reddish hair, details himself to attend the Lady Honourable X at supper. What happened next, we don't know. These were invitations coming from a social elite who saw in these pilots the same traits they themselves valued so highly: good hands, good seat, courage, skill, and the recklessness of the fox hunter. Indeed, Charles Portal, the commanding officer of the training wing that included Harlaxton, and the future Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Air Force in World War II, married Joan Welby, the daughter of Sir Charles Welby of Denton Manor on the other side of the manor. He had a slight advantage over his other pilots because he flew his plane into their park when he came a-courting, which was a bit flash, really. Hence, he wins the daughter of Joan Welby. Now, this coming together socially of a technological elite and a social elite does preserve Egerton's model. But it was now embodied by a new model officer and gentleman, as young men, one could argue, transformed their self-identity and transformed their social standing in a society that looked upon them as the modern equivalents of the chivalric knight. Now, the chivalry of the air war was, as John Moreau bluntly describes it, bunk. The purpose of the daily air patrol, beginning with the dawn patrol, was to use technology to find and kill the enemy as efficiently as possible. But as Rutledge demonstrates, technical proficiency was being combined with the reckless dash and daring of the cavalryman to produce the iconic World War I flying officer. Or, as Arthur Gould Lee, a future air marshal, described them, a new winged aristocracy of warriors. And this was also a new imperial air aristocracy because the Royal Flying Corps and its successor, the Royal Air Force, was by 1918 a truly cosmopolitan force with pilots from across the empire, such as these young Canadians who were at Harlaxton, all training together in England and then serving together in France. Now, unlike the Canadians, the Australians would eventually form their own dedicated Australian squadrons. However, these squadrons too were trained in England. Hence, number 68 Australian Squadron arrived at Harlaxton in 1917 for its training. This would train up to become a fighter squadron, hence these DH-5s that they're stood in front of. But initially, it too was a temporary training squadron for Australians, as the Australians were looking to train up its own pool of pilots to fill these aeroplanes. Among those training at Harlaxton with number 68 Squadron would be Harry Cobby, who would become Australia's leading air ace in World War I. It was at Harlaxton that he first looped the loop, which he described as, quote, feeling like $1 million. And as I have no idea how $1 million feel, the description is apt. It did feel pretty damn good, though. Initially, the squadron was also given a British adjutant, the future military historian Basil Liddell Hart. He describes the Australians at Harlaxton as brilliant pilots, but rather a wild lot when off duty. Unlike our students today. Models of upright behaviour. Some of them, and if you do this, you're going home. Some of them like to go out rabbit shooting by air before dinner. One of them handling the machine, while the other stood in the observer's seat and took pot shots at rabbits from the gunner's seat in the nose, while it was flying very low over the fields and hedges. Now, one could argue that's a novel way of learning the new skills of ground air support, where pilots would be flying low to strafe the enemy, or in this case, rabbits. Among these pilots was, however, we've got Harry Cobby, who is basically an air god, but you've also got potentially Australia's greatest pilot, Stanley Muir. And again, the uniform is so significant. Jodhpurs, boots, Sam Brown belt, top to tail, a cavalry officer, but in the Air Force, in the Royal Flying Corps. And he's there with Burr, which was the squadron mascot who came with them from Egypt, because they've come out of Egypt to come to the UK. An Australian journalist arriving at the aerodrome in the late hours of a sunny autumn day watched a group of keen young Australians go through their evening stunts. So stunting's now a daily part of the daily routine. A typical long-jawed young Anzac, and that's Australian and New Zealanders, Anzac Corps, wearing the ribbon of the military cross under the white wings of his tunic, detached himself from a group of officers, pulling on his leather coat and cap as he walked. He jumped into the pilot's seat and rose into the air. Then the pilot pulled on his joystick, and at an amazing angle, the little scout shot upwards. Then commenced the most wonderful aerial game, a 1,000-foot dive from which he zoomed up with exquisite grace. A few seconds breather, and then he appeared to just let the aeroplane go, down and down, the wings revolving in terrifying fashion. But it was only part of the everyday game, the spinning nosedive. Back to high level again, the air swimmer turned on the whole box of tricks, looping backwards, looping forwards, and otherwise exhibiting the same mastery of the air as the pre-war stunt flyers Cecil Healy and Frank Beaurepaire. And that was Stanley Muir. Tragically, during another such display, one of his wing struts snapped, and he too was killed. And his funeral was at Harlaxton. According to Vernon Uckey, a mechanic with the squadron, his body was borne upon a gun carriage covered with the Union Jack, and his Sam Brown belt on top. There was a firing party of 72 Australian machine gunners, a splendid Australian military band, quite 100 officers from the surrounding camps, and the 3 squadrons of Flying Corps at Harlaxton, the 44th, 54th, and the Australian 68th. We marched about a mile to Harlaxton Church, where a short service was held, and then some of his brother officers carried the coffin out to the grave where the burial service was gone through. The grave from top to bottom was lined with flowers. Harlaxton is a very pretty little old English village. He's buried in an extremely pretty and peaceful spot, but I suppose his friends will come back and take the coffin to Australia. Of course, his friends never did, and so today Muir still rests in Harlaxton Churchyard alongside Stanley Rutledge and another Canadian, Alec Charlesworth. Their graves are a memorial to the events of a century ago, when men from across Britain and the Empire travelled to the English countryside and travelled to Harlaxton Manor. There, they trained to be combat pilots, literally at the cutting edge of modernity. But in so doing, they transformed their social and self-identity. For example, Sergeant Alex Kinzer of the 2nd Hampshire Infantry became 2nd Lieutenant Alex Clines, Royal Flying Corps, a modern officer and a gentleman belonging to a new aristocracy of the air. Thank you very much.